Welcome to the Samurai Joinery build series. For this first prototype, I'm looking at building a Torii-inspired entry table. I'm hoping this entryway table becomes a signature product of the Samurai Joinery business going forward. I know it's a bit loud at the moment. I hope you can hear my voice over this rain overhead. Unfortunately, we've got a tin sheet roof, so you get a bit of sound when it does rain. As you can see behind me here, I have a series of offcuts from pallets that I've pulled apart over the last few weeks. So what I'm going to do today is rough cut this timber, followed by squaring it up on the jointer and finally planing it to thickness, so we've got some nice clean stock to work with for our glue ups for all our components. So hopefully we can come up with a product that looks reasonably high end from all this scrap timber, then put it on the market and see if we can find any buyers for it. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. When I made this first cut, I had no idea how true those words would become. At the time, I thought I was simply building a table, a Japanese-inspired console table that would become the first piece in what I hope will one day become an entire collection of furniture. What I didn't realise was that over the coming weeks, I'd be learning new techniques, fixing mistakes, changing designs, and pushing my skills further than any project I'd tackled before. This wasn't just the beginning of a table, it was the beginning of a journey. The first step was preparing the timber. Most of the material for this build started life as reclaimed pallet timber, so before I could begin any joinery, every piece needed to be machined, cleaned up, and brought back to life. To create the legs, I laminated multiple pieces together to form solid 50 by 50mm sections. It was repetitive work, but this stage would lay the foundation for everything that followed. In Japanese culture, there is a concept known as kaizen, continuous improvement through small incremental steps. Standing here preparing timber, it's easy to focus on how much work still lies ahead. But every pass through the machine, every board cleaned up, and every piece prepared moves the project one step closer to completion. The same idea applies to my own journey. I'm not where I want to be yet, but each day in the workshop, each new skill learned, and each project completed moves me a little closer. The samurai understood that mastery wasn't achieved in a single moment. It was built through countless repetitions of simple tasks, performed with care and attention. The same is true of any craft. Before you can create something remarkable, you have to be willing to do the ordinary work first. One of the biggest design challenges in this build was working out the 5-degree angled joinery. On paper, it looked fairly straightforward, but actually machining the joints accurately was a completely different story. This was a technique I'd never attempted before, so there was a fair bit of trial and error along the way. To make it work, I designed a series of angled wedges that supported each component at exactly the right angle while I cut the mortises. It took a lot of experimentation, but once everything finally lined up, I knew the foundation of the table was starting to come together. Because this was the very first prototype, I deliberately chose to cut many of the joints by hand using Japanese saws and chisels. When you're developing a new design, slowing down can actually be an advantage. Working by hand gave me a better feel for how each joint came together, where tolerance mattered, and what could be improved for the next version. The goal wasn't to build the fastest table, it was to learn everything I could from building the first one. Once the design is refined and all the dimensions are proven, that's when I can start thinking about jigs, machinery, and a more efficient production process. With the main joinery underway, it was time to machine the remaining frame components, including the stretchers that would tie the whole structure together. It was around this stage that the design began to evolve. As I dry fitted the frame, I felt it needed something more to ground the piece visually. Inspired by traditional torii gates, I decided to add timber feet to the base of each leg. Those small blocks would not only provide a stronger visual foundation, but also reinforce the Japanese influence that inspired the entire design. Sometimes the best design decisions aren't made on the drawing board, they reveal themselves during the build. While I was fitting the feet to the legs, something unexpected caught my eye. As I pulled the feet slightly away from the bottom of each leg, a small shadow line appeared between the two pieces. That tiny gap created the illusion that the legs were floating above the base. It wasn't something that I'd planned in the original design. In fact, it happened completely by accident. But the more I looked at it, the more I liked it. It gave the table a lighter, more refined appearance, while still feeling strong and grounded. Sometimes the best design ideas aren't the ones you sketch on paper. They're the ones you discover by accident in the workshop. And that floating detail became one of my favourite features of the entire piece. Something about working in the workshop at night that I can't quite explain. Maybe it's the warm lighting, the quiet, or simply being able to focus on one task at a time. Whatever it is, this is where I find myself slowing down. Applying the finish is one of my favourite parts of any build. As the timber comes to life, everything feels a little more peaceful. After a long day at work, this workshop has become my place to think, create, and recharge. It's the reason I keep coming back. Not because it's easy, but because this is where I feel most at home. To reinforce each joint, I added an 8mm eucalyptus hardwood dowel. Structurally, it helped lock the joint together and kept everything aligned while the glue cured overnight. But it also added something visually. The darker eucalyptus contrasted beautifully against the lighter pine, turning what could have been a hidden reinforcement into a small design feature. I always enjoy details like this, where strength and aesthetics work together rather than competing with one another. As the joinery continued, I had the chance to put one of the newest additions to my toolkit to work. The router plane. It's a deceptively simple tool, but it's brilliant for the fine-tuning joinery. Rather than trying to get it perfect fit in one cut, it lets me sneak up on the final depth, a fraction at a time until the tenons fit cleanly and precisely. I found that patience at this stage usually pays off later, with tighter joints and a cleaner assembly. Once I was confident with the joinery, it made sense to start looking for ways to improve the process. For the remaining stretcher tenons, I switched over to the bandsaw, which made the cuts quicker while still giving me enough material to fine-tune the fit by hand. That's one of the advantages of building a prototype. The first version teaches you what works, what doesn't, and where you can become more efficient. If I build a second Torii table, I'll be refining this process even further, making it faster without compromising the quality of the joinery. Okay, so here is our frame beginning to be assembled with our first stretcher in place. I have made a bit of a mistake though. As you can see, there's a mortise just in the front there. There was never meant to be a mortise there. I've obviously mixed up the legs and missed out on putting a mortise on the back leg on the right. So until that gets rectified, I won't be able to fit the bottom stretcher. Thankfully, the mistake was easy enough to fix. A small timber plug, a bit of glue, and after everything was cleaned up, there was barely any sign it had happened. With that behind me, it finally felt like the project was turning a corner. The experimentation was beginning to pay off, the joinery was coming together, and for the first time, the pile of timber on my bench was starting to resemble a piece of furniture. From this point on, the vision I'd had in my head was slowly becoming a reality. With the frame coming together, I felt like the design needed something to soften all of the straight lines. The clean geometry reflected the inspiration of a torii gate, but I wanted a single detail that would add a little more character and elegance. That's when I decided to introduce a curved lower stretcher. With the design settled, it was back to the bandsaw to rough cut the profile before refining it by hand. As the individual components came together, I wanted to give them a consistent design language. Rather than using traditional roundovers, I chose to soften the edges with small chamfers. To me, the crisp, clean lines of a chamfer feel much more in keeping with the Japanese-inspired aesthetic I'm aiming for. It's a subtle detail, but when it's repeated across every component, it helps tie the whole piece together and gives the furniture its own identity. With the frame complete, it was time to move on to the drawer carcasses. At first glance, they seem like fairly simple components, but because the legs are splayed, the drawer carcasses couldn't be built square. Their end panels had to match the same angle so everything would fit together seamlessly. That meant that every cut had to be carefully planned and machined to maintain the geometry of the design. It was another challenging stage of the build, but every successful piece brought the table one step closer to becoming a finished piece of furniture. So to match the 5-degree splay, I needed to machine the drawer carcass ends to exactly the same angle. My first idea was to build a sled with angled wedges that would support the panels as they pass through the thicknesser. In theory, this was a simple solution. But after a few passes, I noticed a snipe at the ends of the boards was becoming more pronounced. The more material I removed, the worse it became.
rather than risk ruining the parts, I stopped while I was still ahead and switched to the electric hand plane to finish the angle by hand. It's one of those moments where you have to adapt. Sometimes the original plan doesn't work as expected, and knowing when to change direction is just as important as having a good plan to begin with. With the support rails installed, everything was finally in place. Now came the fun part. It was time to assemble the drawer carcasses and watch another piece of the puzzle come together. Separating the two drawer units is a small upright known as the gakuzuka. On a traditional Japanese torii gate, the gakuzuka is the central post that sits beneath the top beam. I wanted to carry that design element across into the furniture, giving the table a subtle connection to the architecture that inspired it in the first place. With the frame able to stand up on its own now, I was able to get it up on top of the workbench to add more stain. I chose black Japan for the frame because it completely transforms the character of the timber. As the stain soaks in, the grain remains visible beneath the surface, creating an appearance that almost reminds me of the traditional Japanese burnt timber finish, shaosugi-ban. It was at this point that the table really started to come alive, and for the first time I could see the vision I'd imagined taking shape. The next step involved machining all of the drawer components as accurately as possible. Because these drawers needed to fit neatly between the runners inside the carcasses, consistency was everything. Once the rip fence was set in the cabinet saw, I tried to machine every matching part to the same size without changing the setup. That way, when it came time for assembly, the drawer boxes had the best chance of coming together square, consistent and within tolerance. As I began to cut the drawer fronts, I realised they needed a 5-degree bevel on each end to match the splayed angle of the frame. For these prototype drawer fronts, I deliberately chose a rougher piece of reclaimed pallet timber for this one. I liked the rustic character it brought to the piece, and a prototype is the perfect opportunity to experiment with different materials and finishes. Not every idea will make it to the final production version, but that's exactly what this first build is for: testing, learning, and discovering what works best. But what good would a Torii table be without the drawer handles shaped like a Torii gate? It seemed like the perfect opportunity to carry the design theme through to even the smallest details. So I headed over to the bandsaw to rough out the handles before refining their shape on the spindle sander. Sometimes it's the little details that give a piece its identity. Finishing these drawer handles felt like a real turning point. It had already been an epic journey to get to this stage, with plenty of challenges and lessons along the way. There was still more work ahead, but for the first time I could genuinely see the finish line. Once these were sanded smooth and finished in black Japan, I knew they would become one of the standout features of the table and help bring the entire design together. By this stage I was so determined to see the project through that I even found myself getting up early on Sunday mornings just to make a little more progress. Often it was simply to get a coat of finish on first thing, giving it the rest of the day to dry while I got on with everything else. When you're this close to the finish line, every spare hour counts. After doing this routine for most of the year, something has changed. My body has almost adapted to the long days. No matter how tired I am after work, as soon as I step into the workshop, it's like I get a second wind. For those couple of hours, the fatigue fades away and all I want to do is build. It's become more than just a hobby now. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning, and every evening spent here feels like another small step towards the future I'm trying to create. With the base almost complete, it was time to turn my attention to the tabletop. The next step was machining a series of timber slats that would eventually be glued together to form the top. Rather than using reclaimed pallet timber, I chose pine for this part of the build. It still had a few knots and plenty of natural character, but it had far fewer defects, nail holes and imperfections than the pallet timber, making it a much better choice for the tabletop. Sometimes choosing the right material is just as important as the design itself. To make the tabletop more manageable, I decided to build it in 3 separate sections. By gluing up just 3 boards at a time, each panel was still narrow enough to run back over the jointer and flatten after the glue had cured. Once all 3 sections were flat and true, I could use biscuits to align them before gluing the entire tabletop together and sanding it as one. It takes a little longer, but with my jointer only capable of handling panels up to about 150mm wide, this approach gave me the best chance of ending up with a flat, stable tabletop. While looking around the workshop, I came across an old solid steel trailer door frame. It wasn't designed for woodworking, but its weight and rigidity make it the perfect clamping aid. By laying it across the tabletop during the glue up, it helped keep everything flat while the clamps pulled the joints together. Sometimes the best workshop tools are the ones that were never meant to be tools at all. tabletop complete, I needed a way to secure it to the main frame. Since there was a gap between the underside of the tabletop and the drawer carcasses, I couldn't simply screw straight into it. Instead, I made a series of timber cleats that were glued to the underside of the tabletop. That gave me something solid to drive screws into from the carcass rails below, creating a strong and discreet fixing system while keeping all of the hardware hidden from view. Sometimes the simplest solutions end up being the most effective. This next step didn't quite go to plan. The smallest threaded inserts I could get for the drawer handles were 6mm, which meant I needed to drill a 9mm hole to install them. Unfortunately, there was simply too much material to remove from a handle of this thickness, and the timber split as I drilled the hole. Rather than making another handle, I glued the crack immediately, clamped everything back together, and installed the threaded insert while it was still aligned. The insert helped hold everything in position as the glue cured, and after a little sanding later on, the repair was barely noticeable. It was another lesson learned. For the next version, I'll be sourcing smaller threaded inserts around 4mm, which should be much better suited to handles of this size. With all of the major components complete, the final stage of the build was in sight. It was time to fix down the tabletop, fit the drawers, install the drawer fronts, and finally attach the custom handles. I always feel this part of a project feels like the sprint to the finish. After weeks of designing, machining, and solving problems, every component fitted brings the piece one step closer to completion. The excitement starts to build because for the first time, you can finally see the finished furniture instead of just a collection of individual parts. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you for coming along on the journey. It certainly wasn't the quickest build I've ever done, but it was one of the most rewarding. There were plenty of challenges, a few mistakes, and more than a few lessons learned along the way. But standing here now, looking at the finished piece, I'd say it was all worth it. Well, it's finally finished. This table's been one of the biggest challenges I've taken on so far. There are plenty of redesigns, mistakes, setbacks, and moments where I didn't ever think the table would get over the line. So, we're welcome to the family, the very first Samurai Joinery prototype. It's a very surreal feeling having it sitting here in front of me after spending 68 hours, mostly after work most weekdays, for the last 2 months or so. Much bigger journey than expected. Now comes the next step. I'm going to put this table up for sale and see what the market thinks. It might not sell straight away, but it'll teach me a lot about what people value and give me information on how I can improve the next version. To think that this table started out as a pile of rough timber and reclaimed pallet wood, and has become this. It's a pretty satisfying feeling. This is only the first Torii table, and I've already got plenty of ideas for how I can improve the next version. I'll be sure to keep you updated on what happens with this one, including whether it finds a new home. If you've enjoyed following the journey, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next episode of Samurai Joinery.